Hey everyone! This is a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button. It lets me know that you are enjoying my content. Also, feel free to drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. The first thing people notice when they step into my shop is how different it is from every other pawn shop they've been to. There's no clutter, no random piles of tangled electronics or cracked screen phones. The glass display cases gleam under the warm light, neatly lined with watches, vintage jewelry, pocket knives, and rare coins. The wooden shelves are dusted, carefully organized with everything from antique cameras to vinyl records, each piece placed with purpose. I keep things tidy, orderly, honest. It doesn't smell like stale cigarettes or desperation in here. The air carries the scent of old books, worn leather, and polished wood. Some customers say it reminds them of their grandparents' houses. I like that. The shop is wedged between an old bookstore that barely gets any foot traffic and a laundromat that's probably one broken machine away from shutting down. It's been this way for years, small, steady, just enough to get by, until recently when business started booming. I didn't change anything. No special promotions, no flashy advertisements. And yet suddenly, more and more people started choosing my shop. At first, I was just grateful. Then, I started paying attention. My name is Marla Quinn, and I run this shop with a steady hand and a sharp eye. I've been in the business for over a decade, long enough to know when something feels off. I'm not the kind of person who jumps to conclusions. I believe in facts, logic, and paying attention to details others ignore. My shop isn't built on greed. I buy fair, I sell fair. I don't take stolen goods, I don't do shady deals, and I sure as hell don't rip people off. And yet, people used to choose other shops over mine. Tony's Treasure Trove was the most popular pawn shop in town. He always talked a big game, promised the best deals, and told customers that I was a stingy, self-righteous bitch who wouldn't give them a good price. Tony Greaves hated me, and it was no secret why. Years ago, before I met my husband Liam, Tony and I dated, briefly. If you could even call it that. He thought he was charming, but he was arrogant and pushy, always convinced he could sweet-talk his way into getting whatever he wanted. When I turned him down for good, he didn't take it well. After that, he made it his mission to drag my name through the mud. Customers would walk into my shop, listen to my price offers, then scoff and say, Tony would give me double that. Most of the time, I'd smile and tell them, then you should sell it to Tony. Because I didn't care about winning a bidding war over junk. But Tony, he made a lot of money that way. He took in anything and everything, flipping stolen goods, lowballing desperate sellers, and cutting corners wherever he could. It worked. Until it didn't. One by one, his employees got sick. Some quit, saying they felt like the shop was cursed. Then one of them collapsed behind the counter and never got back up. Customers stopped coming. Some said it was bad luck. Some said they felt uneasy just walking in the door. In the end, Tony was forced to sell everything just to get out of town. He sold it all to Mark. And that's when things got even worse. Mark Tiller was different. He was one of the good guys, or so I thought. Friendly, honest, reasonable. He ran Mark's Money Mart on the other side of town, and we weren't really competitors. His shop was bigger, louder, flashier. Not my style, but he was a decent businessman. And he was friends with Liam. Mark and his wife came to our barbecues, our game nights. He'd ruffle my dog's fur and tell Baxter he was the real king of the house. So when Tony came to him, desperate to unload his inventory, Mark didn't hesitate to buy it all. 2 months later, Mark was dead. It started small, angry customers, broken electronics, a robbery, but then he got sick. It didn't make sense. One day he was fine, the next he had cancer eating him alive. We visited him at the hospital. Liam sat at his bedside, talking to him like they had all the time in the world, even when we knew they didn't. The last time I saw Mark alive was at our family barbecue, one that felt more like a funeral. That was when he told me about her. It was late, and most of the guests had gone home. The grill had gone cold, the scent of charcoal and sizzling meat still lingering in the air. The yard lights flickered. Baxter lay at my feet, dozing, his ears twitching occasionally. Mark was sitting across from me, his face thinner than I'd ever seen it, eyes sunken but sharp. He cleared his throat. There's one rule you need to follow, Marla. I frowned. Mark, come on, don't talk like this. He shook his head. Just listen to me. If she ever comes into your shop, don't buy anything from her. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Who? Mark's gaze was heavy, unwavering. Lillian North. I almost laughed. Lillian North? The woman was practically royalty in our town. She came from old money, the kind that didn't need to pawn things. Mark, that's ridiculous. His fingers curled into a fist against the table. I thought so too. He told me about the first time she walked into his shop, dressed in a sleek black coat looking like she belonged in a magazine. She pawned watches, rings, expensive trinkets, always high-end, always pristine. Then, 2 days later, a man came in, looking for a watch, the same one she had sold. The bitch. The man had spat. She stole it from me. And that was just the beginning. After that, everything fell apart. Customers were angry. People started whispering about who Lillian was sleeping with. And somehow, every single one of them had something to hide. Mark exhaled shakily, looking me dead in the eye. It all started with her, Marla. The second I bought something from Lillian North, I was done for. The rain hadn't let up since dawn. It fell in steady sheets, pattering against rows of black umbrellas, collecting in puddles around freshly dug graves. The sky above was a smothering blanket of gray, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and wilting flowers. I stood under an umbrella, my fingers curled around the handle, knuckles white. The muffled whispers of the crowd blended with the sound of raindrops against leather shoes and damp coats. Mark's wife stood at the front, her shoulders trembling under a black shawl, flanked by her 2 sons. Liam stood beside me, silent, his jaw clenched tight. He hadn't said much since Mark passed, but grief hung heavy on him. Baxter whined softly at my feet, his fur damp from the drizzle. He didn't like the tension in the air. Neither did I. The priest's voice was a low murmur, reciting words that felt empty in the face of it all. Mark shouldn't have been here. He was 40 years old, strong, sharp, always the first one to crack a joke, always the one flipping burgers at Sunday barbecues. He had a wife, kids, a business he built with his own hands. And now? Gone. Gone in months. The thought made me shudder. Beside me, Liam exhaled slowly, staring at the coffin as if expecting Mark to sit up and laugh at the whole thing. As if this was some cruel, elaborate joke. But the coffin didn't move. The funeral droned on, a monotonous blur of speeches and eulogies. People said the same things they always say when someone dies. Too soon. So unfair. What a tragedy. But no one asked why. No one wondered how a man like Mark, so full of life, could wither away in the span of months. Except me. I thought about the last conversation we had. There's one rule you need to follow, Marla. Never buy anything from Lillian North. I shifted uncomfortably, my gaze drifting across the sea of somber faces. That's when I saw her. She stood at the edge of the cemetery, just beyond the reach of the funeral crowd. Lillian North. Even through the rain, she was pristine. Her sleek black coat clung perfectly to her body, untouched by the downpour. Not a single strand of her long, ink-dark hair was out of place. Her lips were painted a deep crimson, the only color against the gray world around her. She didn't hold an umbrella. She didn't flinch at the rain soaking her shoulders. She just stood there, watching. My grip tightened on the umbrella handle. Why was she here? She hadn't known Mark. She hadn't spoken to him outside of their pawnshop transactions. Unless, my stomach twisted. Had she come to see what she had done? Had she come to make sure he was really dead? Baxter growled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. He didn't like her. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I should have said something to Liam. I should have nudged him, whispered, "Do you see her? She's right there." But before I could move, thunder cracked, a violent, ear-splitting crack that rattled my bones. I flinched. The entire funeral party flinched, and when I looked back toward the trees, she was gone, vanished, as if she'd never been there at all. The service ended soon after. Liam squeezed my hand as the crowd drifted toward their cars, murmuring empty condolences. "You okay?" he asked softly. I hesitated. I should have told him. I should have said Lillian North was here, but instead I nodded. Yeah. I wasn't sure if I was lying. As we turned to leave, I cast one last glance at the cemetery. There was no sign of her. But somehow, I knew, this wouldn't be the last time I saw Lillian North. The week after the funeral, the shop was busier than ever. People swarmed in like they were drawn to the place, bringing armfuls of jewelry, antiques, electronics, anything they could flip for quick cash. The register rang constantly, the shelves were getting emptier by the hour, and I was working overtime just to keep up. It wasn't just the volume of customers that unsettled me. It was who they were. I dealt with shady sellers before. People trying to pawn stolen goods, drunks looking for a quick payout, desperate faces willing to haggle over pennies. But lately, it felt like something else had crept in, the people Mark had warned me about. I saw it in their eyes, in the way they spoke in low voices, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching. One man brought in a grandfather clock, still dripping from the rain outside. A smell clung to it. Something damp. Something sour. When Dante asked him where he got it, he just stared at him, unblinking until Dante stopped asking. A woman came in holding a wedding veil. It was beautiful, delicate lace, expensive craftsmanship. But there was a dark stain near the hem, a shade too deep to be wine. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. We were short-staffed that night. Elise had called out sick, Sam left early, and Dante, hating night shifts, grumbled in the back, sorting through a box of silverware. I was alone at the counter, tired, but too wired to think about closing early. The bell above the door jingled. I glanced up, and for a second, it was like the world held its breath. Lillian North had arrived. She glided in, moving like she belonged here. Like the pawn shop was just another boutique on Fifth Avenue, and not a place where people dumped their broken dreams for a few crumpled bills. Her black coat was sleek, hugging her frame like it had been made just for her. Not a single wrinkle, not a single drop of rain. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders, glossy and dark, as if she had just stepped out of a magazine spread, and her lips, deep blood red, the only color in the dim yellow glow of the store. For a second I felt like I was seeing something not quite human. Then she smiled. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was smooth, effortless. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a watch. Gold, pristine, expensive. She set it down on the counter. "I'd like to sell this," she said, tilting her head slightly. My stomach twisted. Mark's voice echoed in my head. "There's one rule you need to follow, Marla. Never buy anything from Lillian North." I swallowed hard. My fingers twitched at my sides. It was just a watch. There was no proof it was stolen. No reason to say no. And yet, I hesitated. She watched me, eyes dark and patient. I forced a breath. "I'll have to take a look at it first." She slid it across the counter, her manicured nails tapping lightly against the glass. I picked it up, inspecting the details. The craftsmanship was flawless, the kind of watch that should have been sitting in a velvet-lined case in some rich man's collection. Not here, not in my hands. I turned it over. The back was engraved, CL, 1978. The initials meant nothing to me, but they meant something to someone. I exhaled slowly and set it down. "How much do you want for it?" Lillian smiled. "Whatever you think is fair." Her answer shouldn't have irritated me, but it did. Most sellers had a number in mind, even if it was ridiculous. They always wanted more. They always haggled. But not her. It was like she didn't care. Like it didn't matter to her at all. I counted out the money, pushing it toward her. Lillian took it with delicate fingers, folding the bills neatly, tucking them away into her coat. Then she looked up at me, and she smirked. "It's nice," she murmured, sliding the watchless hand back into her pocket. "When no one asks questions." My throat felt dry. I couldn't bring myself to respond. The bell above the door jingled again as she turned on her heel and walked out. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head as I reached for the watch to put it in inventory. That's when I heard the growl. Low, deep, a sound that curdled my blood. I turned sharply. Baxter was staring at the door, teeth bared, his fur bristling. He'd been curled up under the counter, asleep. I hadn't even noticed him wake up. But now he was wide awake, his ears pinned back, his whole body tense. He let out another growl, a warning, as if something dangerous had just walked out of my shop. The watch sat in the display case for 3 days before a man came looking for it. He was middle-aged, dressed in a stiff navy suit, his eyes scanning the cases with an agitated edge. When I greeted him, he barely acknowledged me, his fingers drumming on the glass until he spotted it. "That one," he said, his voice clipped. I pulled the case open and set it on the counter. He reached for it, then paused, his eyes narrowing like he was seeing a ghost. Then his jaw clenched, and he exhaled sharply through his nose. "That bitch." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "She stole this from me," he muttered, grabbing the watch like it had wronged him personally. "You bought it off her, didn't you?" I hesitated, but he was already shaking his head, muttering curses under his breath. "I should have known. She's got a habit." A habit. I didn't ask what he meant, and he didn't explain. He just paid for the watch and left, disappearing out into the night like a storm cloud rolling past. That was the first time I heard someone speak about Lillian North with venom. It wasn't the last. The shop at night had a different kind of silence. During the day, there was always noise, conversations, the register dinging, the hum of foot traffic outside. But at night, when the last customers had gone and the doors were locked, the place felt different. The shadows from the glass cases stretched longer, distorted by the dim glow of the fluorescent lights overhead. The air felt thicker, heavier. I caught myself staring at the front door more often, waiting, wondering. And sure enough, Lillian always came back. Every 2 to 3 weeks, she'd arrive at the same hour, always just before closing, always with a new piece of jewelry. The first time after the watch, she brought in a platinum ring, too fancy to be something she'd just casually decided to part with. Then, a delicate diamond bracelet. Then, another watch. The items were never cheap, never ordinary. They all had weight. Stories she never told. And I never asked. I thought about Mark. Never buy anything from Lillian North. I thought about stopping, refusing her sales. But every time she came in, I did the same thing. I evaluated the piece, I named a price, and she took it without haggling. It was like a game we were playing, except I didn't know the rules. The rumors started small. I overheard them in whispers between customers, in the back and forth gossip that pawn shops always attracted. "She's got some nerve, walking around like she owns the place. I heard she stole from half the damn town. She gets them in bed first, then robs them blind." At first, I thought it was just exaggeration. People love to talk, love to turn ordinary scandals into legends. But the more I heard, the darker the stories got. The men she stole from were never innocent. Some were politicians, some were businessmen with nasty reputations. Some had abuse charges swept under the rug, or wives who left town with bruises they refused to explain. It always started the same way. A man would brag about sleeping with her. Then a few days later, he'd realize something was missing. A watch, a ring, a bracelet, something important. After that, things would spiral. Their business deals would fall apart. Secrets would come out. People would stop trusting them. And by the time the dust settled, they weren't in control anymore. I told myself I didn't care. That whatever Lillian did with her life wasn't my problem. But deep down, something about her unsettled me. And the more I thought about her, the more I started noticing something else. Something closer to home. Liam was acting strange. At first, I blamed it on Mark's death. They'd been good friends, maybe not inseparable, but enough that losing him had left a mark. But then he started working late, a lot. The first time, I barely noticed. The second time, I made a joke about it. By the third week in a row, I stopped joking. He was tired all the time, distant. And when I mentioned our anniversary, he blinked like he'd forgotten it existed. "Oh," he said, "that's coming up, isn't it?" I waited for him to correct himself, to say, "Shit, I'm sorry, I've been so caught up in work." But he didn't, and that was the moment I knew. Something was wrong, I just didn't know what. Not yet. The shop was quiet that afternoon. The rush from the morning had died down, leaving the place in a familiar lull of ticking clocks and soft footsteps. The ding of the cash register echoed in the stillness, and the sun slanted through the front windows, casting a glow over the display cases. Gold and silver glittered under the glass, catching the light in delicate flashes. Rings, watches, necklaces, each one a story, each one abandoned. I was restocking a case near the counter when I heard the bell above the door jingle. I didn't even need to look up. I already knew who it was. Lillian North moved like she owned the place. She never hesitated, never wasted time browsing. She walked in like she already knew what she was going to do. She came to the counter, pulling off her black leather gloves one finger at a time. Then, with the same careful ease as always, she slid something across the glass. A ring. A simple band of platinum, slightly worn around the edges. Nothing fancy, nothing extraordinary. Except, my breath hitched. I knew this ring. I knew it down to the smallest scratch on its surface. I picked it up, my hand suddenly cold. It felt too familiar, too intimate in my fingers. I turned it over. Inside, etched in delicate script, were 2 initials. LQ. My stomach twisted. No. No. Further down, almost faded from years of wear, was our secret phrase, the one we had chosen together. The one we had joked about after too much wine and laughter, the one Liam had said was ridiculous but perfect. No matter where, always home. A tear slipped down my cheek before I even realized I was crying. I gripped the ring tighter, as if I could squeeze the truth out of it. Then, in a hoarse whisper, I said it out loud. He's been doing this for months. Lillian didn't flinch. She just watched me, her dark eyes calm. Then she gave a small, knowing nod. You weren't the first. I felt something inside me crack. Everything in the shop seemed too bright, too sharp. The reflections in the glass cases, the soft hum of the old ceiling fan, the distant chime of the wind outside. It was all wrong. I was wrong. My whole life, my marriage, my home, my trust, Liam had been lying to me. For months, maybe longer, and Lillian knew. She had known all along. She had come into my shop, stood across from me, slid stolen jewelry onto my counter, and let me buy them. Never saying a word. Until now. Until it was my husband's ring on the table. I sucked in a shaky breath, my fingers tightening around the band. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. But instead, I looked up at her. And for the first time, I asked, why? Lillian tilted her head slightly, watching me, the way a cat watches a bird fluttering too close to its claws. The weight of Liam's ring burned in my palm. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of every broken promise, every lie he ever told. I swallowed the lump in my throat and set it back down on the counter. I couldn't hold it anymore. Lillian said nothing. She didn't gloat, didn't sneer, didn't offer me false sympathy. She just waited. I could have asked her for anything. Revenge. Justice. I could have told her to ruin him the way she had ruined the others, to strip him bare, to make him suffer, to take away everything he had taken from me. But I didn't want that. I didn't want him at all. I just wanted to forget. I exhaled, my voice quieter than I expected. I want to forget him. Lillian's expression flickered. Not surprise, not confusion, something else. Something like intrigue. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the glass counter. That's an unusual request, she murmured. I looked away. I didn't want to see my own reflection in her eyes, the way I must have looked. Small, broken, desperate. I don't want his name in my head, I said, my voice steadier now. I don't want to remember what he looks like, what his voice sounds like. I don't want to wake up in the morning and have to remind myself that he isn't beside me anymore. I looked back at her then, forcing her to see me. I want to forget him like he never existed. Lillian considered me for a long moment. Then slowly she smiled. Not cruelly, not mockingly, just amused. Like I had asked for something that she had never been offered before. Something she was interested in trying. All right, she said simply. No hesitation, no second guessing. She slid Liam's ring back toward me with the tip of her finger. It's yours, after all. I didn't touch it. She gave a slow nod, turned on her heel, and walked out of the shop. The bell above the door jingled softly, and just like that, she was gone. The moment she left, I felt it. A hollow space inside me, like a thread had been pulled loose, like something had been carefully, surgically removed. The shop was exactly the same. The shelves still full, the cases still locked, the air still carrying the faint scent of old books and worn metal. And yet, something was missing. I blinked, my head feeling strangely light, like I had just woken up from a dream I couldn't quite remember. My fingers drifted to the counter, brushing against the cool metal of the ring. I frowned. Why was there a ring here? I picked it up, turning it over in my palm. It was beautiful, well crafted, but I didn't remember putting it there. Had someone left it? A customer? I stared at it for a long moment, searching my memory for the answer. Nothing came. I let out a slow breath, suddenly exhausted. It didn't matter. I'd figure it out later. For now, it was time to go home. The walk home was quiet. The sun had long since set, leaving the streets bathed in the glow of flickering streetlights. The rain from earlier had dried up, but the pavement was still damp, reflecting the neon open signs from the late-night diners and liquor stores lining the street. Baxter trotted beside me, his leash loose in my grip. He was unusually calm tonight, barely pulling, barely sniffing at the usual spots. Maybe he could sense it too, that strange emptiness curling at the edges of my thoughts. I played with the ring on my finger as I walked, rolling it between my thumb and index finger. It was a simple platinum band, smooth and familiar against my skin. And yet, I didn't know where it came from. That thought should have bothered me more than it did. I frowned, stopping under a street lamp. I slipped the ring off, holding it up in the weak yellow glow. It was beautiful, expensive, something meaningful. So why couldn't I remember who gave it to me? I turned it over. There was an inscription inside the band, worn but legible. No matter where, always home. A chill ran through me. The words meant nothing. They should have meant something. And yet, looking at them, they felt like a riddle I would never solve. Baxter whined at my side, sensing my unease. I shook my head, slipping the ring back onto my finger. It didn't matter. I'd figure it out later. For now, I just wanted to go home. When I reached my house, the first thing I noticed was the front door. It was open. Just slightly, a crack of darkness visible between the door frame. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching. I never left the door open. Slowly, I stepped forward, pushing it open with the tip of my fingers. The hinges creaked, revealing the familiar warmth of my living room. The lights were on, casting a soft glow over the couch, the framed photos on the walls, the half-finished mug of coffee on the table from this morning. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. Then I heard it. The clatter of a pan, a shuffle of movement in the kitchen. I went cold. Someone was in my house. I stepped inside, my hand instinctively going to my phone in my coat pocket. Baxter let out a low, uncertain growl, his ears pinned back. From the kitchen, a voice called out. Casual, familiar, like I was the intruder. "Hey, you're home late. I thought you were closing early tonight." I froze. I knew that voice. Except I didn't. The air went tight in my lungs, a sickening déjà vu wrapping around my ribs like a vice. My hand trembled against my phone, but I stepped forward anyway, moving past the living room toward the open doorway of the kitchen. And then I saw him. A man. Standing at my stove, stirring something in a pan. Like he belonged there. Like he had done this 100 times before. I had never seen him in my life. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. He glanced up, frowning at my expression. "What?" His brows furrowed. "Marla? What's wrong?" I screamed. The spoon clattered onto the stove as he jumped, startled. Jesus Christ, what the fuck? He took a step back, his face twisting in confusion, in anger. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I couldn't breathe, my heart slammed against my ribs, my vision tunneling. "Who the fuck are you?" I choked out. He stared at me like I had lost my mind. He took a slow step toward me, hands up. "Marla, stop. You're freaking me out. What's wrong with you?" Baxter snarled, lunging forward. The man barely dodged in time, scrambling back against the counter. "What the hell? What's wrong with the dog?" Baxter's teeth bared, his hackles raised. His whole body was bristling with fury, lips curled back as he snapped at the air. I staggered back, my fingers fumbling as I ripped my phone from my pocket. My pulse hammered against my skull. "I don't know you," I gasped. "I don't fucking know you." His face twisted in something ugly. "What the fuck are you talking about?" His voice was rising now, panic bleeding into anger. Then something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not concern, something darker. Like realization. Like he was finally understanding what was happening. And he didn't like it. "No," he whispered. His breath hitched, his hands flexing at his sides. No. What did you do?" I was already dialing. The second the operator's voice came through the speaker, I gasped out the words. "There's a man in my house. I don't know him." He lunged. I stumbled back just in time, Baxter snapping his jaws between us, teeth catching the fabric of the man's sleeve. "Baxter, back!" I yelled, heart in my throat. The man reeled back, panic in his wide, wild eyes. He was shaking his head now, muttering under his breath. "This isn't happening. This isn't fucking happening." Sirens. The distant wail of them cut through the air like a blade. His head snapped up. For the first time, I saw something I did recognize in his face. Fear. But it wasn't the kind of fear someone has when they're about to be arrested. It was the fear of someone who knows what's coming next. The sirens got louder, the lights flashed outside, the door burst open and officers rushed in. They grabbed him before he could react, twisting his arms behind his back as he screamed. He fought, not like a guilty man, like someone who was being erased, like someone who had just realized he didn't exist anymore. And the whole time, as they dragged him out kicking and cursing, he never stopped yelling one thing, over and over and over again. "Marla, please, you know me. You know me." But I didn't. I didn't know him. I had never seen that man before in my life. The man, whoever he was still screaming. Baxter lunged again, snapping at his leg this time, his teeth catching fabric but not skin. I didn't tell Baxter to stop. I didn't need to. He didn't know this man. He was acting purely on instinct, and instinct told him that this man was a stranger. I stood frozen, watching as the police dragged him toward the door. One of the officers, a middle-aged guy with tired eyes and a firm grip, turned to me. "You know him?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. I shook my head slowly. I've never seen him before in my life. The man let out a choked, desperate sound. "Marla, please." His voice cracked, hoarse from shouting, from begging. I stared at him, but I felt nothing. Not fear, not anger. Just hollow. "You know me," he tried again, his voice dropping to something softer. The fight was leaving him now, like he was starting to understand, like something was being peeled away, layer by layer. His breathing hitched and then he went silent. The officers led him outside. The night air was cold, but I barely felt it. I stood just inside the doorway, watching as they shoved him into the back of the patrol car. His eyes met mine through the window, wide and desperate. But something was changing in them. Something was fading. His face was already starting to look less familiar, less real. The way dreams do when you wake up. I watched as he sat back in the seat, blinking slowly, his breaths coming in sharp, shallow gasps. And then, just like that, he stopped struggling. His expression went blank, his body slumping slightly, as if he wasn't really there anymore, as if he had never been there at all. The car pulled away, tires crunching against the pavement. The sirens faded into the distance, swallowed by the dark. Baxter whined softly beside me, pressing his body against my leg. I absently ran a hand through his fur, but my mind felt adrift. There was no relief, no sense of safety now that he was gone. Just this aching emptiness, like I had lost something I would never get back. I looked down at my hand, fingers still curled into a loose fist. Something was there, something small, cool against my skin. Slowly I opened my palm. A ring. Simple. Platinum. It glowed faintly in the light of the porch. I turned it over. There was an inscription inside. "No matter where, always home." I stared at it. The words meant nothing, absolutely nothing, and yet, my chest ached. I couldn't explain why. I clenched the ring in my fist, my nails pressing into my palm. Then, without another word, I stepped inside and closed the door.